Hello audience. In this video I'm going to upholster the bottom cushion and I'm going to start working on the wood inside the body. Now first I'm going to assemble the bottom cushion, then we'll take a closer look at the original seat upholstery and compare it to the work I did. So let's get started. And here's the original bottom cushion spring set. Now, other than the little surface rust, there's not really anything wrong with it, surprisingly. So we're just going to reuse it. Now when these were upholstered originally, the material was held in place by this channel. There was this big machine that compressed the entire cushion to where it should be, and then the material was just put in this channel here and pinched over, and that was it. It makes sense for mass production, but the problem is it can only be assembled once. You can't take it apart and correct anything on it. So what I do with these normally is I just close the channel up and attach it to the springs with hog rings. I also wrap this in some kind of heavy-duty material so the sharp edges don't tear holes in the vinyl, which is what I'm doing here. This is leftover top material I'm just installing with hog rings. It's not completely authentic, but it will work, and you won't be able to know the difference as long as the cushion is sitting in the car. And now, time to assemble it for a trial fitting. Okay, it's installed, kind of just thrown on, just to make sure it works. So next we'll take it back off and install the buttons. Now here's the original bottom cushion seat upholstery that I was able to carefully remove without damaging it. And we'll take a closer look at some of the unique stuff on it. Now I found some very interesting features about this. Now, first of all, the welt on the edge of the seat is surprisingly small. It's only about 1/8 inch in diameter. It's padded with 2 layers of natural cotton. Now the pleats, they don't have a back on them. They're not piped like the Model A's were, but the top layer of padding was cut into strips to kind of make the pleats look like they were padded. The buttons, as somebody else has already pointed out, they're not wrapped in vinyl like most new ones. They're bare steel. I believe they were painted originally to match the vinyl, and they have prongs on them instead of an eyelet. So they just go through the material, and these are bent over on the back. They're not tied down or anything. Now on the sides, I found a few interesting things. Here's a seam, which is kind of crudely done, and it's in a very random location. It's not at one corner or the other, it's kind of in the middle. There's another one on the opposite side in about the same location. It's a little nicer. This is also the joint where the welt ends and begins. And here's the new one that I just finished, and we'll look at that more closely. Now, when I said I was going to make a near perfect copy of the original, that ended up being quite an exaggeration. Now, the first problem I ran into was the welt size. I tried looking for a 1/32 inch diameter core to make the welt, and after a little searching on the internet and a local upholstery supplier, I discovered that was not a standard size anymore. Now I could have done some experimenting and figured out how to make a smaller diameter welt, but that would have taken more time, and I don't want to do experimentation on somebody else's car. I'd rather stick with methods and materials that I know. So I just opted for the more modern 1/16 inch diameter core. And unless you know better, it does look authentic. On the side, you may remember the original, it had one seam across the middle, or towards the back about here, and it was just the two ends overlapping each other with one stitch through it. Now, after some thinking, I decided that was just too tacky for me, so I ended up putting 2 seams in it and making them a little more proper. I made sure I put them around the side far enough so you couldn't see them when the cushion is installed. The end for the welt I decided to put in the back, in the center of it, where it won't be visible when it's installed. Because again, putting it on the side like the original was just a little too tacky for me. Now, as I've said before, the original buttons were just metal painted black, and I opted to use the more modern vinyl wrapped buttons. Reason being, this is what I've used on previous cars, and actually I already had these ordered before I discovered the original seat upholstery. Now, I have seen these advertised available new, but they are a little pricey, and I'd have to wait a week or two to get them, and it's kind of an authenticity level that's not really necessary for this project. These, like I said, are vinyl wrapped. They look the same, they're just a little fancier, and again, to those who don't know the difference, it looks okay. But what's really important is it has prongs on it instead of an eyelet, so it will function like the originals, and visually that does make a big difference. So at this point you may be wondering, well, what, if anything, did I copy from the original? Well, 2 things. I copied the width of the pleats, which is 3¼ inches on this car, and the location of the welt, which is just a little bit below the edge. Now, the general rule with these pleats is the tighter you get it this direction, the more pronounced they are, the tighter you get it in this direction, the more flat they are. Now, since they don't have the padding attached to them, the way they look can vary greatly depending on how they're assembled and how it's installed. Now, looking at photographs of original cars when they were new, the pleats look like they just kind of barely have individual padding each. They're just a little bit higher in the center than they are on the ends. They're not perfectly flat, but they don't have a lot of rise to them either. Pretty much the way you see it here. Now, like the original, I cut the top layer of cotton into strips so it hides the seams a little better. Another important thing is the buttons. Now, if these are the eyelet type that you tie down on the back, if you get them too tight, this can be a low spot. You can even put a crease across here. And if they don't sink down at all, they can stick up, and that doesn't look good either. This is pretty much how they looked originally. They're just sunk in a little bit just so they're not sticking out above the rest of the seat. And it's just kind of helping it form a pleat on here. Now, this upholstery technique is somewhat unusual for present day, and I'll talk more about it when we start working on the backrest. The worst part is the door. As you can see, the framing is kind of loose, so I'll have to do something about that. It's got a little problem here. This piece here kind of warps this way, which looks kind of bad, but in spite of this, the door still fits pretty good. Now, removing this, I'd have to pry the door open, and that would compromise the paint finish. So, like I said, it fits really good, so I'm just going to work around it. What I've been doing is made a triangle out of wood, glued it in, attached it with screws, and that's tightening it up pretty good. So I'm going to do the same thing around the rest of the corners. Alright, it's a few days later. I put one of these triangles in 3 of the corners, and it's holding pretty good now. Another thing I discovered was this piece was actually leaning out this way, so I adjusted that. This block that holds the latch on, it was loose, and I couldn't pry it all the way off, so I drove a screw in it here and filled the gap with glue here and clamped it together and held it for a few days. Now, the screw holes for the latch were all worn out, and it had oversized screws in it, and those weren't holding. So I cut out some wedges and glued them in all the screw holes. And I dug through my collection and I found some more authentic screws for the latch. So I'll put it all back together and see what happens. And now it's ready to install. Now, one thing I'll point out is some of these doors had a sheet metal panel nailed to the inside, and I think this one did originally, so you can kind of see where it was. It obviously went missing years ago. I'm not going to make one and install it because they seem to work without it. Well, that's it for this video. Now, I've been working on other parts of it, like the tack strip. I've been patching that together, and a few other things, but that'll just have to wait for another video. So anyway, thank you very much for watching. We'll see you in the next one.